territory or drug territory, they're not as technically professional. Very seldom do you hear about these mobsters taking out a bunch of innocent civilians. Usually if they're doing something, they kill who they're looking for and nobody else, as opposed to these guys that just shoot out cars and start taking out babies and small children. But it happens all the time in Chicago, and it's like commonplace. I mean, if it's funny because if a day goes by in Chicago where there's not a murder, it makes news, because we generally have about 2 a day. So if in a 24-hour period nobody's killed in Chicago, it actually makes the news. So I don't think it's that different than it was at the time. I just think we get these images that it was like the Wild West back then, and it wasn't. It was the same as it is now.
So to get back to the north side versus the south side, is how much of it had to do with more than just the revenge aspect? I mean, to get the whole thing rolling, you had the Irish versus the Italian. Was it a matter of the fact that that it was two different, basically two different countries and backgrounds with two different beliefs? Because I know the Irish rather didn't really believe in the prostitution rings and that portion of it. And the Italian part did, or was it more just about this is a group of people that just had money issues at stake?
I think it was mainly. I mean, obviously there's probably some part of the ethnic thing that figures into it. I don't think it's kind of even like with current gangs. It's all about the money, and it's always been about the money. In fact, there's warring gangs that as long as they can make money together, they will get along together, as long as they're making money together. So, and I assume it would be somewhat similar back then. Most of the stuff you had was, you had, territory lines drawn, and as long as you did your business in your area and the other group did their business in their area, it was generally kosher. But then all of a sudden, someone wants to expand, and you shake down one certain bar and say, hey, you're going to start buying your booze from us. And the guy says no or says yes, and then the other group shows up and says no. Moran is threatening me and wants me to, and so it was a matter of it was all about money and trying to keep your territory and not let anyone encroach on your territory. And ultimately, someone wants to expand and get bigger, and they figure, well, they're bigger and tougher, and they can take away more territory, and then that's when the problems start. So it's pretty much, and of course the revenge thing comes in, obviously, because, so-and-so killed so-and-so, so now we got to avenge their death. And it's pretty much the same as it is now with the warring gangs. We killed so-and-so, so we got to go and take out 2 of their guys. So it really hasn't changed all that much. And there's still cops and being paid off, and there's still, they just busted a bunch of those guys, a bunch of those jailers. I forget where that was. It was just a couple of days ago. Some big federal investigation, and there were like 7 or 8 jailers. I think it was a county jail. I can't remember. I wish I would remember exactly when it was, or where it was. But I know it wasn't anywhere around here or the Chicago area. But they were running a drug ring on the inside with the gang members. So it's like they were giving them phones and moving stuff back and forth for them, and actually going to drug deals and wearing their uniforms. So it's crazy, So, but yeah, you have that. It's mainly about the, going back to the question, it's mainly about the money, primarily. And Capone, everyone loved Capone that didn't cross him. I grew up in Cicero, and Cicero was Capone's headquarters. He moved his headquarters out of Chicago pretty shortly or soon after he became someone big. He wasn't in Chicago for all that long. For someone who was only there for like maybe 6 years, he became pretty big pretty fast, and he had to move out of Chicago, his main operations, because it was too hot. He was too afraid. He had his life almost taken a couple times with hits, in his limousine, and decided to move out to Cicero, just west of Chicago. And you couldn't. When I was in high school, my girlfriend did a research paper and talked to Capone's sister. And literally, I couldn't find anyone who lived in the town when he was there that would say a bad word about him. They thought he was the greatest thing since sliced bread, because he donated a bunch of money to the churches, ran a lot of the soup kitchens, yeah. So And it's a great guy as long as you didn't, as long as you weren't keeping him from doing his job.
It seems to me, I don't know how you feel about it, Travis, or you, Vic, or you, Ray, to be honest, but I mean, it seems to me that it's always been the sort of the same old formula. Probably what got me into the mob thing when I was younger, other than those, the movies and stuff, was I found it fascinating, the corruption at Tammany Hall, even just a year later, with the disappearance of Judge Crater, and then in the 70s with Anthony Provenzano and Jimmy Hoffa. It's like, if you're edging somebody out of having some money, that's where the problem is. As long as they're making money and you're making money and nothing changes, then, like you said, everything's kosher, everybody's good, no harm, no foul. But the moment somebody steps into somebody else's territory, all hell breaks loose. And a lot of people don't believe it, but I think the mob was connected to Crater's disappearance. I'm fairly certain they were connected to Hoffa's, but I'm pretty sure they were connected to Craters because, he was part of the Tammany Hall thing, which was happening in New York right about the same time, or a year after the Valentine's Day Massacre. So.
Right. And then, of course, even the Kennedy assassination. The more and more I read about that, the more and more people I talk to, it seems more and more that it was the mob and the CIA involved. Not to get into super conspiracy theories, but, there were too many of these guys in Dallas at the same time. It was just, there's no reason for half those guys to even been there. Everyone from Woody Harrelson's father to, I can't even get into half the names of the guys that were there, but I went and saw a play in Chicago called Assassination Theater, which was done by Hillel Levin, and he was a journalist for a long time and had done some investigation on his own, and it was an awesome play. I think it's still running over at the Museum of Broadcast Communications. They go into the whole mob ties to the Kennedy assassination. It was fascinating, and they did it as a play, which was very cool.
Well, I'll tell you what, you talked about some of the things going on now. How much of a connection is there, or if any, and I don't live in Chicago, but I got to assume there's some remnants of something left over of the mob somewhere floating around, just listening to the way people talk. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So how much of their...
authorities,
yeah.
If you talk to the authorities, the mob's dead.
Mm-hmm.
Officially, according to the FBI and whatever, the organized crime's dead. I think that's silly. I think it's obviously still going on. It's pretty much, anything where there's wagering going on, I'm sure there's mob influence. It's not as, I think it's just changed. If you're talking about the Italian mob, I think that there still is remnants of it. You've got, until fairly recently, 70s, 80s, Family Secrets trial, all that sort of stuff, that took a big hit on them. And they may have moved operations. But when you're talking about the casino game, over in Rosemont, Stevens Center, Stevens was supposedly mobbed up pretty highly in Rosemont. And supposedly that's originally why they wouldn't get the casino license in the first place, is because he still had mob ties. And then after he died, in fact, they named the Stevens Center after him before he was even dead, So, he had a pretty big ego, but Donald Stevens. But he passed away, and as soon as he passed away, they got the casino license. So I don't know if that was just a political move, a PR move, because obviously if he was mobbed up, that means he was mobbed up with somebody. It wasn't just him. So obviously they're still around. It's not as... I'm sure they're still involved in the prostitution. For a long time, they wouldn't be involved in drugs. A lot of the guys, Accardo, didn't like to be involved in drugs. It's kind of like you said, they picked their own vices, and certain vices they didn't get into, whether it was on a ideological standpoint or just the fact that they weren't all that good at it. I guess, you had your favorite things to do, like running numbers or booze or prostitution or drugs or, you name the vice, but obviously the third, during Prohibition, the big thing obviously was alcohol. And then when Prohibition dried up, then it was the numbers game. It was more the gambling than anything else. So they just go on to just whatever black market stuff they can run.
So during this era, in the 20s-ish era, what is it specifically about Chicago that you think made it so ideal for corruption the way it was? As compared to some of the other major cities, people, when they think of corruption, Chicago's either at the top or near the top of the list.
No, Chicago's at the top.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just be honest. We got to be number one at something, right? But yeah, I mean, we were running the state. I mean, just for just even let alone Chicago, you're talking the entire state. I mean, the corruption around here is just crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the thing. It goes back to the history of Chicago. We were born of corruption. I mean, and what we consider corruption now wasn't corruption back then. It was just the way you did business. So it wasn't until some of the federal laws were being passed about politicians taking money on the side or giving selling jobs or whatever. Kind of like Blagojevich, when he was selling the Senate seat here, when vacated by Barack Obama. When he became president, about him selling the Senate seat, he didn't think he was doing anything wrong. I kind of believe him because it's been like that in Chicago for so long. I mean, back in the if you go back into the 1800s, I mean, police jobs, there were no police academies. You didn't get any police training. A police job was basically a job that was given to you if you supported the mayor. So if you supported a particular candidate, then one of the biggest jobs they gave out were cop jobs. They would hand you a badge and a stick and a uniform and tell you to hit the street. And you would get your money and you'd have a great paying job and well, maybe not great, but it paid. And because there was no training, there was no professionalism, then a lot of what the cops did was make money on the side by pressing people, or just walking in because I'm a cop, I can do what I want. So, I mean, it was just kind of the corruption started from the very beginning and just became kind of the way Chicago did business. And it caused Chicago to build up very quickly. Things got done very quickly. There wasn't a whole lot of red tape to run through as long as you knew the right people. So it helped build the city and became part of its culture. And so it's very difficult to weed that out, and a lot of people didn't want it weeded out. I mean, Chicago was mainly Republican before the labor movement in the late 1800s with the Haymarket riots and whatnot, and then I think the last Republican sheriff I think was back in 1890 something, and then the labor movement started. And then with the labor movement and the unions, then the mob also found a way to go into there because there was huge amounts of money to be made with the labor unions. If you belong to a union, you pay your dues, and then you have these huge coffers of money that they could then use to pay off politicians or, whatever they needed to do. So I think the labor union had something to do with it as well. But again, it's actually also a fine line. I used to say this all the time. There's a fine line between a cop and a mobster. I mean, there really is. I mean, I hate to say it. I'm probably going to make some enemies now, but kind of like the loyalty, the camaraderie, kind of like you watch my back, I watch yours, and really, I think that probably that's why this Fred Crescenti, who was the Chicago cop, made such a great cop, because he was more than familiar with the way the mob worked and the way criminals worked, and then of course he became a cop and they trained him, and he was an excellent cop. So I think it's a fine line, and I mean, New York has its corruption. I mean, New York is obviously famous for the mob as well. Any of the really big cities, but Chicago started in corruption. Chicago started. I mean, it was basically the first public building in Chicago was a tavern. So,
it's to me really fascinating that something could get so far out of control to that point. And you talked about the romanticism of the gangster lifestyle back then.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel like, I mean, I don't know, obviously I say back then, but I still feel like there's obviously some of that still going on today where people romanticize what went on back then. But can you pinpoint the St. Valentine's Day Massacre as maybe the moment where it was kind of went from something that was kind of cool and flamboyant and everybody wanted to be a mobster to, oh shit, this has gotten serious and horrific?
No, I don't think it ended at all. I think it just continued on, into the 30s, into the 40s. Frank Sinatra, the whole Rat Pack type of thing. They liked hanging out with gangsters.